Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. In this video, I'm going to be planting this Japanese maple right here into this container behind me. This particular one has been trained to go back and forth like this. It's not that hard to do this with these Japanese maples. It just takes time and patience. It's basically been tied back and forth along this bamboo stake for several years to get it to be shaped like this. That's not the reason I'm really shooting this video. I wanted to show you kind of how to pick a Japanese maple and then talk some about how I plant woody shrubs and trees into containers and what considerations for the soil that you should be using for that. This variety is called Tamukeyama. It's a red foliage variety. It's a weeping Japanese maple. It would weep down to the ground. It would have had a central leader and be weeping down to the ground if it hadn't have been trained like this. It's grafted like other Japanese maples. I want to show you something on this graft that's very, very important. So I want you to take a look. These Japanese maples are grafted onto a rootstock. It's another Japanese maple that has a hardier root system than the top part of this maple. And they're grown for a while, cut off, and then this one was grafted onto it. And you'll see that little bulbous area. Sometimes it'll be near the ground and sometimes it'll be further up on the stem. But what I want you to notice on this one is that the rootstock tree is trying to grow here. This is something you're going to look for when you're buying grafted trees, and that would include fruit trees like apples and pears and others, and Japanese maples, cherries like weeping cherries, weeping redbuds. There's lots and lots of grafted trees. There's even grafted roses. But if you see that bulbous area down at the bottom, just inspect it, make sure it's in good shape. This one already had some weird stuff on it even before this stuff was coming out on it. I saw this at the garden center. I saw these pieces coming off. I didn't want to sell it to a customer. So I've brought it home. I'm going to take these off, clean them up. I'm going to plant it in this container. I suspect that I'm going to continue to have these trying to grow from that rootstock tree, and I'm going to have to keep cleaning it up in the future. Just didn't want to put that off on a customer. If I ever let these take off and grow, they will grow much faster and much more vigorously than the top portion of this plant. You can see how this one's been trained and is contorted going up here. And I need a heavier piece of bamboo in this one, and that way I can start to bend this piece back like this and continue to shape it like it's been shaped. But again, the main thing you're looking for buying a Japanese maple, make sure all the limbs are pliable like this one. It's late winter right now. It hasn't started leafing out, but even all the way up to the top right here, all this stuff is pliable. I can bend it without it breaking, so it's all alive. And then inspect down here around this graft and make sure the graft is in good shape. Make sure there's no growth like this coming from it or no noticeable pieces that have been cut off of it recently. Otherwise, you're going to have to fight that constantly. And like I say, all the energy from this tree will go to these and not the top part of the plant. And it'll just be an ongoing fight. If you're watching this video on YouTube, I'll link a playlist I have for Japanese maples if you want to learn more about different varieties of Japanese maples. I've covered maybe 4 or 5 so far on the channel. And you can learn more if you're looking for a specific variety and want more information about a specific variety. This is more just in general what I wanted you to look for when you're picking, no matter what variety you're picking, just to make sure it's healthy from top to bottom. They are a big investment. This tree right here, especially the way it's been trained right here, it's been many years to get it to this point. So you're going to pay quite a bit for them, so make sure they're in good shape. My container here is probably about a 10-gallon container. That's a 7-gallon pot. That's about as much as I'd like to pot one up. I don't like to put them in big giant containers. I'll end up overwatering it. It'll need to go in a bigger container next year if I'm going to keep it as a container plant and not end up putting it in the ground. At the bottom of the container, you need something that will drain the water that passes through. There's a hole in the container. Make sure you have a hole in the bottom of your container. Very important with anything. I use pine bark at the bottom of the container. It just does a good job of allowing that little reservoir of water to be able to drain out of the bottom of the pot. A lot of people will use gravel for this, but this is just a chunky pine bark. You can use pine bark mini nuggets. That would be totally fine. And I'll put maybe 3 inches of this at the bottom of the container. I think most people would be tempted to just use a potting soil. Potting soils typically hold a lot of water, and I am going to use potting soil, but I'm going to mix a little bit of this bark into this potting soil to make sure it drains pretty well. When you buy your tree, it'll almost certainly be grown in a pine bark mix. And right here on the top of this container, I don't know how well you'll be able to see that, but it's just a chunky pine bark mix with a little bit of sand in it. The sand is actually in it just to put some weight in the container to keep it from blowing over all day, because the bark doesn't weigh a whole lot. That's the reason it's in the container. But they love that bark. It does dry out a lot, so I'm mixing some of that potting soil in with it just to keep it reasonably moist so I don't have to water it every day. Once it's planted, I'll water it in really well so the water runs out of the bottom of the container, and then I'll probably be able to go, you know, close to a week initially without having to re-water it. And then over time, as it roots out into this pot, I'll have to water it more and more frequently over time. So the next step, I'm gonna put some of this potting soil in there up to about where the container is gonna sit. Okay. These are pretty sturdy, so I don't mind picking them up, you know, around that graft. I'm going to break these roots up a little bit where they've been circling. I'm going to be pretty vigorous with it down at the bottom. These are off color a little bit. I think it got a little bit of winter damage on some of these roots. That may be the stress that's been driving this weird growth below the graft. I've got it where it's maybe 2 inches, an inch maybe, right below the lip of this container, and I do that so that I have a water reservoir. So if you leave it up too high, you'll water it and the water will just run over the edge of the container. So make sure you leave that little bit of reservoir area for water to sit. I'm gonna make sure he's straight for sure. And I'm gonna put a little bit of this bark around here so that I can slowly mix it in with my potting soil and then tuck it down in the side like that. This potting soil by itself, like I say, would just be too wet. We don't want to pile anything up on here. You saw me pile it up initially, but I'm going to get rid of all that. I'm not going to cover anything that wasn't covered initially in the container. This pot's kind of weird because it's bulbous on the side, so I've got to find all those areas on the side and make sure I'm packing this down all the way around. We don't want air on those roots. Want some air, but not this amount. So this is just a simple pine bark and potting soil mix. So that potting soil will hold some moisture, but not too much. Okay, again, I'll make sure he's straight. That's an important part of this. So I know you can't see it all that well before the leaves come on it. It's about 2 more weeks probably before it's completely covered in foliage. I put some plant tone fertilizer in the container, just a dusting of it. I haven't watered yet. I wanted you to see that fertilizer. This may be a little too much sun where I have it, and I'm gonna let the plant tell me that. If the leaves start getting a little crispy in June or early July, I'll move it to a space that has a little more midday shade. I've cut some trees down recently. I don't know how sunny this spot is going to be. It's been shady for the last few years. Could be quite a bit too sunny at this point, but I'll adjust it at that point. I also cut off all the pieces down here around the graft, all those pieces that were sticking off the side of it right there. And like I say, I'm going to have to keep an eye on this. If this is something you see in your yard where it looks like another tree is coming from the ground on a grafted tree, it is another tree coming from the ground, and those pieces need to be kept cleaned up on it. If you see that in a garden center or a nursery or someplace, I would probably just avoid that tree, because I think this will continue to be an issue. So thank you very much for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for future videos.